Okay, welcome to this presentation. I've been invited to give a talk about one of the products we tested from AAA, which is X3 Digest, in a study we've conducted at Schotters Feed Research, also known as SFR. My name is Anna Huting, and I will lecture through this topic in the coming 30 minutes. Before we go directly to the results, we will first give you a bit of background on post-weaning stress and the reason why highly digestible protein sources in piglet diets are key. And then, of course, we will go through the results of the digestibility trial we've conducted. So first of all, post-weaning stress. I guess you all know what that involves, but just to highlight shortly, especially with the current situation we're facing right now with the absence on in-feed and antibiotics, we increase the risk of post-weaning disorders. So during lactation, piglets are exposed to limited stressors because they're still with the dam. They still have access to milk, which is highly digestible. But as soon as we wean them in intensive production systems at around 3 to 4 weeks of age, then they will encounter a lot of stressors. A few of those are summed up here. For instance, a new environment. They leave the farrowing barn and go to a weaner facilities. They will get exposed to a new diet. So they will not get a liquid diet anymore, but they are fed a solid diet, which has a different ingredient mixture as well. For instance, starch. Piglets has never been exposed to starch before, and now all of a sudden they got a diet with starch in it. Also, the animals are mixed with unfamiliar animals, and that also induces stress. And on top of that, their immune system and intestinal system is quite immature. So they're not able to fully encounter all these stressors to a full extent. And all these factors influence the production efficiency of these animals. And as already mentioned, on top of that, we have the ban on in-feed antibiotics. And also in Europe, we are facing detrimental reductions in zinc and copper. So we're not allowed to use them either in a diet or at very limited amounts. And this all increases the risk for post-weaning disorders. Generally, we select this post-weaning stress phase in two different periods. We divide them in an acute phase and a more maturation phase. An acute phase, we normally say it's around 5-10 days. So let's say around a week, 2 weeks. And during this acute phase, animals are exposed to anorexia because they are getting an unfamiliar diet, they don't like it. Feed intake drops. The microbiota is also not stable and really is very variable, fluctuates a lot. We will see some damage of the intestinal wall, the absorption, the digestion of the nutrients is not optimal. So there's a lot going on that doesn't favor the digestion of ingredients or feedstuffs in general. After that acute phase, we have the maturation phase. So the acute phase is basically we have a higher risk of post-weaning diarrhea. During the maturation phase, this risk decreases. Feed intake goes back up. Nutrient digestion and absorption is improved again. Fermentation capacity, which was reduced during the acute phase, will go up again. And also the microbiota is getting more and more stable. And also the functional activity of the digestive system is recovered. So during the acute phase, you often see some villi atrophy. During this maturation phase, it goes back to more or less normal again. There are various ways how we can help piglets to have a good start. So overcome all these stressors, all these problems during the first, let's say, week post-weaning. And some of them are summed up here, but for now we will focus on the crude protein content of the diet, as well as the digestibility of the ingredients and synthetic amino acids. In the Netherlands, we go down with a crude protein level of piglet diets to around 17%. I know that shocks a lot of people because with a low crude protein content, you think you will reduce performance, but that's not the case because if you supplement a low crude protein diet with, for instance, the synthetic amino acids, and you use very high digestible ingredients, these low crude protein diet will not damage the performance of the animal. In fact, it will favor, because if you have a low crude protein diet, then less crude protein will enter the large intestine uningested. If huge amount of crude protein enters the large intestine undigested, this crude protein will be fermented. And the fermentation of this crude protein will increase the content of harmful ingredients or the components that are released with this fermentation, and basically will harm the integrity of the intestinal wall, and at the same time will cause diarrhea. So you basically don't want an overload of crude protein entering the large intestine. So there are several ways of limiting the protein content that enters the large intestine. I already mentioned the protein content of the diet. Next to that, we have the digestibility of the protein sources. The higher the digestibility of the crude protein source, the better it is. The amino acid profile, of course, you don't want to limit the animal, because amino acids are important not only for growth, but also the development of the digestive system and immune functioning. And there are several other factors that can influence the amount of protein in a large intestine. And it's generally known that the older the animal, the higher the protein digestibility is. And that's one of the reasons why we did a digestibility study with one of the products of AAA, which was the X3 Digest, and we compared it with a high-pro soybean meal, which is basically the golden standard we use. We use that on all digestibility studies, and that way we can basically see how good the digestibility trial was performed. And then fish meal we also use to compare the X3 Digest product to. This is basically the analyzed composition of the three different products. So we have analyzed values and table values. So this is the soybean, X3 Digest, and the fish meal. And here you have the moisture, the ash, crude protein, fat, etc., etc. And basically you can see that they are quite in line with the table values. The crude protein content, however, from the X3 Digest is slightly higher compared to what we have received as product specifications. But yeah, these basically the analyzed values are the products we have used. But before we dive into the results, I want to highlight where all the protein digestion starts, because I already highlighted the importance of crude protein digestion, and that you want to limit the amount of crude protein that enters the large intestine. And crude protein digestion already starts in the stomach. The stomach needs an acidified environment, so a certain pH, to convert pepsinogen and pepsin is then able to hydrolyze the protein into peptides. So an acid environment in the stomach is very important for protein digestion. On top of that, an acid environment due to hydrochloric acid production is also important as a microbial barrier. Because basically if the pH of the stomach is low enough, it can kill bacteria. On the bottom, you see an image of the stomach of the pig and the stomach of the human, and you see basically different segments, and the red segment also for the humans is where the pH, the hydrochloric acid production takes place. On the image on your right, you will see how the stomach pH develops over time. And although this image is based on a human subject, believe me, it's the same in pigs. And what you basically see after a meal, the pH goes up quite quickly, because basically the meal serves as a buffer. It really buffers the pH of the stomach. And then the hydrochloric acid production starts, and then the pH goes down quickly. And the red box is basically for pigs where the optimal pH is for protein digestion. So basically what you want to achieve is that the pH goes quite down quickly to prevent that before the stomach releases, empties again, not enough protein is digested, and also make sure that enough bacteria are killed. But for piglets, the story is a bit more complicated. For piglets, during lactation, the hydrochloric acid production is quite low. The reason for this is that the lactose that is in the milk basically is fermented by bacteria into lactic acid. And this lactic acid really acidifies the gastrointestinal content, but at the same time suppresses the hydrochloric acid production. And that's really not favoring the stomach development in a way if a piglet is weaned all of a sudden. Of course, we can increase the hydrochloric acid production with providing creep feed that is solid, contains certain starch, other protein sources, etc., etc. But we all know that this crude protein or the creep feed intake is quite low and very variable. And really, to increase the hydrochloric acid production, you need large and frequent intakes. And that's often not the case, especially not in intensive pig production system that wean animals at 3-4 weeks of age. So basically, generally what we see is that piglets, the stomach pH of the piglets is too high. That's also what you see in this image. This image basically shows you the stomach pH and the development over time with age. And what you see here is again the red box in which highlights the optimal pH. And what you see is that it takes around 60 days of age before the stomach is able to acidify sufficiently. So this is very important to understand. And as already mentioned, stomach pH is not only necessary for a good protein digestion, but also as killing bacteria. And these two studies basically show that via an in vitro model. So the image on the left is basically looking at different E. coli strains and then, or the E. coli strain and their growth. So if the line goes down, it doesn't grow anymore. And the different line represent different pH, from a pH of 2.5 to a pH of 7.4. And what you see is with a low pH, the E. coli cannot grow anymore. But with a high pH, the E. coli can grow. On the images on your right, you see basically the same, although they have bacterial survival factor as an indicator, and they looked at Salmonella and 2 different serotypes of Streptococcus suis. The upper graph is at a pH of 2.5, and the lower graph is looking at a pH of 5. And what you see is, although the Streptococcus killed in a pH of 5, Salmonella can still survive. So not only is the stomach pH favoring digestion, also it kills bacteria. And why is that important? Because every time an animal, but also us, if we eat something, bacteria will be ingested at the same time. And if the stomach can kill quite a number of these bacteria will not enter the small intestine and will not cause problems. So in that way, the stomach is also very important. And one of the characteristics that is typical for this X3 digest product of AAA is the acid binding capacity, also known as ABC. Acid binding capacity is basically the amount of acid or base in milliequivalents that is necessary to decrease or increase the pH to a certain amount. And we often refer to ABC4 because ABC4 is then the amount of base or acid that is necessary to increase or decrease the pH to a pH of 4. And basically what you see is that the higher the ABC4 value, the higher the buffer capacity. So the more it can buffer the stomach content. So the higher the pH of the stomach, for instance, will be. And of course, the different compounds of the diet can contribute to this acid binding capacity. Energy in general has a limited effect. Crude protein, on the other hand, has a strong effect on ABCC4, has a high buffer capacity, and so the higher, in general, the higher the crude protein content, the higher the buffer capacity. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why please be careful with the crude protein concentrations in piglet diets. Other factors that influence the acid binding capacity of the diets is the mineral content. These basically have a strong effect on ABCC4, and organic acid. These ones also have a strong effect, but they can actually lower the buffer capacity. Why is this important is basically showing in this graph. So here you see the ABCC4 value, the analyzed ABCC4 value of the complete diet, and the pH of the stomach. And you see a nice positive correlation. So basically suggests that if the ABCC4 value of the diet is high, so you have the high buffer capacity, you really see that back reflected in the stomach pH, because then the stomach pH is also higher. So you basically want to go for low ABCC4 values of your diet. And as I already mentioned, that's one of the characteristics of the product we have tested. X3 Digest has a really low ABCC4 value, meaning a low buffer capacity. Soybean meal, on the other hand, has a high ABCC4 value, but fish meal has a huge and tremendous high ABCC4 value. And the reason for that is not only the crude protein content, but mostly the calcium content. As I already mentioned, minerals can have a high buffer capacity, and fish meal, but also other milk products, for instance, that are used in piglet diets, have a high calcium content, and calcium can really buffer the diet and the stomach content. So you need to be careful with these things. And if we then look at the ABCC4 value of the diet, we see basically the back, because high ABCC4 values in the soybean meal and the fish meal diet, and a lower ABCC4 value in the X3 Digest. And for the diets, we basically included, because the diets consist of a basal diet, which is similar in all diets, and then on the experimental diets, we want to test the feedstuff. We added the feedstuff on top. And the amount of feedstuff that was added is basically similar. The crude protein content contribution of these different products was similar across the different diets. So the inclusion rate might vary a bit between the different feedstuffs, but that's just because of different crude protein level. And we just wanted to make sure that the crude protein contribution of the specific feedstuff was similar amongst all diets. And that has led that ABCC4 value of the X3 Digest was lower, because of course it has a higher, a low buffer capacity. But that's of course one of the characteristics of the feedstuff. And then we go in a bit more detail on the gastrointestinal tract kinetics, so the GIT kinetics, and I will mostly focus on the significant effects we have seen. And I already mentioned a lot about pH of the stomach, and as you can see, we did not find a significant effect on the pH of the stomach. The reason for that is mostly because of the methodology we used to measure the stomach pH. Because basically what we did, we took the stomach content, mixed it, and measured the pH. But as you already remember from the previous image, you've seen about how the stomach of the pig looks like. You basically have two different segments, one with a low pH, basically where the bolus comes in, and the bolus really buffers the stomach content, and a segment where the hydrochloric acid production starts. And if we would have measured the pH at different segments, then of course these results would look differently, but we haven't done that. So that's the reason why probably we did not find an effect on stomach pH. We did see an effect on empty stomach weight, but empty stomach weight on itself doesn't really say too much. So therefore, I would like to highlight the relative stomach weight as shown here, which was also significant. And we've seen a higher relative stomach weight for the X3 Digest product compared to soybean and fish meal. And the reason for that, I will explain you in a bit. Other tendencies we have found is basically the solid to total fraction. And basically, these ones are two different methodologies explained below. Basically, it suggests the amount of solid contact we found in the stomach compared to the total content. And what this entails, I also will show you in a bit. And for ileum, we saw a significant effect on the viscosity. And also those results I will show you in a bit more detail in a coming slide. So as I already mentioned, the relative stomach weight was higher in the pigs that were fed the X3 Digest product compared to the soybean and the fish meal. And the reason for that can be various. One of the reasons can be the increased solid gastric acid content is actually what we already observed, although only with a tendency, because this can increase the stomach weight, but also, of course, the muscular action, because with course, the stomach has to work harder than with fine diets. But that was not the case in this trial. And also, heavier stomach weights can be linked to increased retention time. And that's actually also linked with increased solid acid content, but I will show you in a bit. So this is basically the tendency we've seen, and basically what you see is that the X3 Digest resulted in a higher ratio solids to total content compared to the soybean meal and fish meal. And why is this important? Is basically the empty rate of the fluid fraction is basically faster than the solid fraction, and that's given in this graph. So the upper line is basically the solid fraction as a more linear pattern with respect to empty rate, whereas the liquid fraction really follows an exponential pattern. And the solid fraction basically stays in longer, so really prolongs the retention time of the bolus in the stomach, and this can favors the protein digestion, for instance. So slow gastric empty rate favors digestion because the bolus will stay into the stomach longer, the pH will go down, and the pepsin can work on the protein and hydrolyze the peptides and stuff like that. So it really favors protein digestion. So less crude protein will enter the small intestine intact, for instance. As I already mentioned, we also saw an effect on viscosity being higher in the products with X3 Digest and fish meal compared to soybean meal. But the exact reason why we've seen this is not very clear. And also what we generally see, although things are changing rapidly, is that the viscosity, increased viscosity in the ileum is considered not very good because it can have detrimental effects on pig health and production. So it's something generally you don't want. But to be honest, in this trial, we haven't seen any issues with health problems or anything like that. So it remains unclear what we've seen here, basically. And well, now let's continue with the digestibility coefficients. And for this, we mainly focus on ileal digestibility. And the reasons for that is that the absorption of amino acids is mainly into the small intestine. After that, hardly any amino acids are disappearing in the hindgut, and if they do, it's not efficient. That has no value to the pig. On top of that, if we look at amino acids absorption and, for instance, in the feces and the fecal content, well, for a microbial fermentation can often overestimate the amount of the crude protein that is digested, and it's very variable amongst feedstuff and animals. So basically, it's no point of using that data. So basically what we use for ranking feedstuff, whether they are useful for piglets, for instance, we use ileal digestibility numbers rather than fecal digestibility. And the way we calculated the digestibility coefficients is basically based on a difference method. So we had, of course, the basal diet, and then the basal diet plus ingredients we tested. So basically what you can do is the basal diet plus ingredient, you distract the basal diet from it, and then you will get the digestibility quotient of the feedstuff. That's very simple, simplistic explained, but that's more or less what we do with the difference method. And these are basically the results of these of the digestibility coefficients of the feedstuffs for the soybean meal, X3 Digest, and the Nordic fish meal. And you see that the X3 Digest has a higher crude protein digestibility compared to the soybean and the fish meal. Although on top of that, it's also very important to look at the quality of the protein. And that's often what we do with comparing lysine to crude protein ratio, as you see here, and the SID lysine to crude protein level. And what you see is that the lysine to crude protein ratio is generally higher for the fish meal compared to the X3 Digest. So basically what you see, that the black line is the soybean meal, blue line is the X3 Digest, some table values for soy protein concentrate, the fish meal tested, and the fish meal from NRC table values. And yeah, the fish meal has a higher lysine to crude protein level, which was also actually higher than the table values in the NRC. But of course, the feedstuffs have also other characteristics, such as glutamine. Although glutamine is, of course, not considered an essential amino acid, in suboptimal circumstances, it can be an essential amino acid, as it can favor the development of or support the immune system in challenged conditions, and also repair the gut integrity after, for instance, post-weaning stressors. And that's what you see here as well. Basically, the glutamine to crude protein ratio is higher for the X3 Digest compared to the fish meal. And also, if we look at the SID values, the standardized ileal digestible glutamine, then also again it is higher for the X3 Digest compared to the fish meal, and it's even higher compared to the soybean meal that we've tested. So this is also very important to consider, because glutamine, as I already mentioned, although not considered essential, it is essential in challenged conditions such as the post-weaning period. These are all the standardized ileal digestible amino acid values. You can have a look at it at your own time. Again, the different colors represent the different feedstuffs, and in some cases also table values. And in general, what you see is that X3 Digest had a really high SID amino acid content compared to, for instance, the soybean, but also fish meal. And lastly, I would like to show you the net energy value of the diet. The net energy is determined on a fecal level, and basically consists on a crude protein, fat, starch, sugar, and NSP content. And basically we used the digestibility coefficients at fecal level that we've obtained from the study to calculate these values, and also, of course, the nutrient content. And basically what we've seen is that X3 Digest has a higher NE value compared to soybean meal, but slightly lower for fish meal. But as you can already see, the crude fat content of the feedstuff is quite a considerable amount, explaining that an E value, and the crude fat content of the fish meal was quite high. So that probably explains the higher NE value. And with that, actually, I would like to finalize the presentation. I hoped you enjoyed the presentation, and well, I will hear if there are any questions. Just let me know or pop me an email if you would like. I'm open to answer your questions. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.